At one point on YouTube, Steven Crowder was completely inescapable. If you grew up as a teenager on the internet during the mid-2010s, you know exactly what I'm talking about. After a tiring day of high school, you'd get home and open up YouTube to an absolute onslaught of SJW-owned compilations, Ben Shapiro dunking on feminists, and, most importantly, Change My Mind videos by Steven Crowder. If you somehow don't know, Change My Mind was a series in which Crowder would go to a college campus and debate ill-equipped liberal students on contentious topics, absolutely dismantling them with facts and logic. To conservatives, this was the absolute apex of political discourse in 2017, and my god, was it popular on YouTube. We're talking tens of millions of views, it spawned an extremely viral meme, and it catapulted Crowder to the forefront of American politics. And look, as a dumb 15-year-old who didn't know any better, I became a fan of Crowder. Like, come on. Of course there are only two genders, just pick up a biology textbook, socialism is the definition of evil, and male privilege has literally never existed. Crowder was triggering blue hair feminists who couldn't handle the facts, and my prepubescent brain was eating it all up. But a lot has changed since 2017. Unfortunately, I've developed a minimal capacity for critical thinking, so my politics has lurched to the left, and when it comes to Crowder, well, he's kind of fallen off. The last time he was super culturally relevant was for a brief moment back in 2013, when a video leaked of him verbally abusing his pregnant ex-wife. You know, just a real upstanding guy there, embodying his Christian values. Besides that though, his channel has been losing subs, his views are down, and it kind of feels like the political media landscape has sort of moved past him a bit. It saddens me to say it, but I think Crowder has become a forgotten relic from a bygone era. Well, that was until recently. After the assassination of Charlie Kirk, what opportunistic right-wing grifter wouldn't stage a comeback by reviving their old video format to cash in on all the civil unrest which is currently plaguing America? That's right, Change My Mind is back after a 3-year hiatus, and it's definitely better than ever. So, in this video, we're gonna be taking a look at the return of Change My Mind, The Left is Violent. Obviously, this is a pretty contentious claim to be making, given America's current political climate, especially when all the empirical evidence is against you on this one, but come on. This is Steven Crowder we're talking about. If there's anyone who can do it, it's him. And I'm sure he won't try to manipulate any of the facts. He won't try to pass off debunked lies as evidence, because he's a good faith political actor who just cares about the truth. So, for Crowder's big return to the spotlight, he's heading back to where it all started. Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. This is the same college where Crowder hosted his most popular installment of Change My Mind back in 2017. There are only two genders. Anyway, given recent events in the US, Crowder came with a full team of security, he's wearing a Kevlar vest under his shirt, and there's even bulletproof glass in front of the table to protect him. The discussion we'll be taking a look at in this video is with a lovely woman by the name of Christina, and this is Crowder's central thesis he'll be trying to prove.
By and large, the political violence is coming from the left. It's not proportionate with that on the right. That's the reason for the security that you see today that's very necessary. And it's a problem that's reaching a boiling point that may not be sustainable. If you disagree with me, you're welcome to change my mind.
Now, before we can start refuting this claim, it's important that we define the term political violence as Crowder does. He first gives a more technical definition from The Economist, which Christina reads, but then provides a more general one afterwards.
It's violence as a tool being used toward a political end. In other words, just because you vote Democrat or because you vote Republican, if you accidentally hit someone with your car and commit manslaughter, that's not political violence. If you vote Democrat, but let's say you go out and run someone over because of their politics, that would be political violence. Do we agree on that?
I think I can agree with you on that.
Okay,
yes.
Good.
Now look, if we wanted to be really lame, there are more precise academic definitions out there which take like 15 pages in a journal to comprehend, but we're not going to open that can of worms. For the sake of this video, I think violence as a tool to achieve a political goal is more than adequate. As Crowder points out, it's not enough if someone just happens to vote Republican or Democrat and they accidentally kill someone. No, there needs to be specific political intent. Anyway, Christina immediately pushes back against Crowder's claim that more violence is coming from the left, and she points to the recent assassination of Melissa Hortman as an example. For those unaware, a man by the name of Vance Bolter is alleged to have targeted several Democratic legislators in the early morning of June 14th. He first attacked John Hoffman and his wife, who were shot several times. He then visited the home of Arn Rest, who was fortunately on holiday at the time, and then, most tragically, he attacked the Hortman family, killing Melissa, her husband, and the family dog. We'll go through all the details of the case in a second, but as Christina is explaining this to Crowder, he interjects and just flat denies that these murders are a case of political violence.
The person, Bolter, Vance Bolter, who committed it, specifically said it had nothing to do with politics, and he left a letter reasoning it, saying that Tim Walz had ordered him to carry a hit out on people. So he was very clear that it wasn't in the name of politics. That's someone who happened to be, on some issues, Republican, on some issues, Democrat. And he was appointed by a Tim Walz administration. So that was not done in the name of political violence. He said Tim Walz ordered him to assassinate somebody who was out of his mind.
Oh God, this is where the lying begins. Now, just to be abundantly clear, Vance Bolter has been charged with these murders, but the trial is yet to begin. That means everything Crowder just presented as evidence is purely speculative, just as everything I'm about to present is also speculative. But with that being said, and as I think you'll soon discover, the majority of the evidence points one way and shows that Crowder is being extremely disingenuous here. To knock off the easiest claim first, when Crowder said that the alleged killer was Republican on some issues and Democrat on others, he was just blatantly lying here. There is not a single verifiable piece of evidence which shows Bolter holding liberal views on, well, anything. To quote Bolter's roommate, David Carlson, he would be offended if people called him a Democrat. He was a Trump supporter. He voted for Trump. He liked Trump. This characterization also makes sense because records show that Bolter voted in the 2024 Minnesota Republican presidential primary. His friend Carlson also noted that he listened to InfoWars, and as we all know, Alex Jones is an extremely close ally of the Democratic establishment.
Hillary Clinton.
Vampire.
Barack Obama.
Vampire.
Then there's also his religious views. Bolter has previously said on record that he cashed out his 401k and downsized his house to fund missionary work in the Congo. Whilst there, he was known for giving some pretty interesting sermons. There's people, especially in America, they don't know what sex they are. They don't know their sexual orientation. They're confused. The enemy has gotten so far into their mind and their soul. It also turns out that Bolter has been extremely anti-abortion his whole life. In another one of his sermons in the Congo, he told the congregation that many churches in America didn't listen to Jesus. They're divided, the churches are so messed up, they don't know abortion is wrong, many churches. Now, there's actually an important reason that I mentioned his views on abortion. After authorities searched Bolter's car, they found a list of over 70 people, including Democratic representatives like Melissa Hortman, Ilhan Omar, and Amy Klobuchar. Additionally, it also had the addresses of nearby abortion clinics and a philanthropist by the name of Mackenzie Scott, who had donated hundreds of millions of dollars to Planned Parenthood. Authorities also recovered a notebook from Bolter's home, which had written excerpts like doing what most people know needs to be done, but are not willing to do it themselves, and if you want to save the country, you have to get your hands dirty. It's kind of interesting that Crowder failed to mention any of those details to Christina in their conversation, isn't it? Now, to be fair, Crowder wasn't lying about the letter. Authorities also found a handwritten note in his car addressed to Kash Patel, the FBI director, alleging that Tim Walz contacted him to kill Amy Klobuchar so he could become a senator. Additionally, in an interview with the New York Post from jail, Bolter claimed that the attack wasn't to do with either the Trump stuff or pro-life. These are all very important facts to consider, but none of it automatically precludes this from being an act of political violence, especially with all the other evidence we just went through. For example, we just don't know if that letter is genuine or if it's a ploy for him to look insane so he doesn't have to stand trial and can therefore avoid prison time. To quote the acting US attorney for Minnesota, was it a delusion that he believes, or was it a delusion that is designed as an effort to discredit our investigation, or to frankly excuse his crimes? Again, the trial hasn't even started yet, so everything here is purely speculative, but for Crowder to so boldly dismiss the possibility of this being an act of political violence is completely disingenuous. Like, come on, Stephen. 3 separate Democratic legislators were targeted and attacked over the course of 2 hours, and that fact alone means we should keep an open mind to this situation. Anyway, because Christina didn't spend several hours researching this case before she came and talked to Crowder, she can't produce a rebuttal to his cherry-picked evidence, so she moves on to another example. The recent shooting at a Mormon church. On the 28th of September, a man by the name of Thomas Sanford drove his pickup truck into the Grand Blanc Mormon church. He then opened fire on worshippers with an assault rifle and set the building on fire afterwards. Ultimately, 5 people were killed in the attack, including Sanford, who was shot dead by police. Now, we'll analyze the case in more detail soon, but Christina brings this example up because a lot of the evidence suggests that the shooter was a Republican. This means that this could be a case of right-wing political violence, but rather unsurprisingly, Crowder pushes back on this characterization almost immediately.
Yeah, the media isn't characterizing, even I will say this, even on the left and the right, they're not really characterizing that as political violence.
Okay.
Because it was a guy who really seemed to harbor ill will toward the Mormon church. So it's pretty hard to categorize it as political violence when the targets were largely conservative and the man who carried out the action seems like he might be a Republican.
Now, there's definitely a bit to unpack here, but we'll start with the easy stuff first. As Crowder kind of says himself, most of the evidence points to the fact that the gunman was a Republican. The Guardian reported that an image taken on Google Maps in June at the home address of the gunman shows a Trump sign on display outside. Moreover, Facebook detectives found a post from one of his family members which showed the gunman posing with his wife and child wearing a Make Liberals Cry Again shirt with Trump 2020 plastered on it. Interestingly, there was a lot of extremely influential conservative Twitter accounts that were accusing Democrat politicians of photoshopping this image to put the pro-Trump stuff on it, but this was complete bullshit. Although the family has now privated their account, internet detectives already archived the post, and you can clearly see it was uploaded in 2019 and definitely not photoshopped. Also, the last thing I'll mention here is the fact that the gunman put 2 big American flags in the back of their truck, which they rammed into the church. Not saying that's a smoking gun or anything, but it feels like an important detail in the greater context of everything. Again, this is all circumstantial evidence, but in the balance of probabilities, this guy appeared to be a Republican. Anyway, let's go back to the claims Crowder was making. To quote him directly, "It's pretty hard to categorize it as political violence when the targets were largely conservative and the man who carried out the action seemed like he might be a Republican." No, Stephen, that doesn't actually make it hard to categorize it as political violence whatsoever. Crowder seems to think that something can only reach the threshold of being political violence if it's someone being targeted exclusively for their political affiliation, i.e. they're either left or right wing. But newsflash, Stephen, your religious identity is perhaps one of the single most political things which exists in the world. Even if we do the most bare bones form of research, the second paragraph on the Wikipedia page for political violence literally says, people may be collectively targeted based on the perception that they are part of a social, ethnic, or religious group. And trust me, the gunman was not a fan of Mormons. According to reports, this hatred seems to have stemmed from a past relationship with a Mormon woman in Utah that ended on bad terms. One of his lifelong friends told reporters that he got his whole fascination with Mormons and they are the Antichrist and they are going to take over the world. He even ranted about it to a local politician who was canvassing in the area 1 week before the attack, as within a few minutes of the conversation starting, Sanford was telling him about how Mormons are, again, the Antichrist. This is a person who held a deep hatred for Mormons, and when somebody like that goes out of their way to specifically target that group of people with violence, can you guess what message that sends? You deserve to die for your beliefs. Now look, I obviously agree that this wasn't an attack which had the express purpose of advancing right-wing or conservative political goals. But again, that's not the only definition of political violence like Crowder thinks it is. You need a pretty myopic understanding of politics to think that somebody killing a group of people on the basis of their religious identity isn't a form of political violence, and I'd encourage Stephen to pick up a history book to understand why that is. And look, the thing which particularly annoys me about this example is the fact it's a complete double standard. Like, let's be real here. Do you think Crowder would be open to this level of nuance if the shooter was a black guy who gunned down 4 Pentecostal Christians in their place of worship, then set the building on fire, and it was later discovered that he had a Harris Walls 2024 sign outside his home? Obviously fucking not. In fact, I'm pretty sure we'd have an Oval Office address from Trump the very next day, declaring war on Antifa and the extreme radical left, which Crowder would be gleefully celebrating on his show. Again, a lot of this is speculative, and because I'm cucked by the fact I actually care about the truth, we'll have to see what investigations turn up later down the line. Personally, I'm happy to eat my words on anything I say in this video, but I know Stephen Crowder definitely isn't. New spot. Oh. Let's change the spot a bit. Okay. Anyway, Crowder pivots off this pretty quickly and decides to move to a more clear-cut example.
The reason we're here, and I don't think you would argue that this is unnecessary, the assassination in cold blood is an act of terrorism of Charlie Kirk. Is that political violence? You seem so confident on the Hortmans, but not Charlie Kirk.
I was just thinking about your question.
Oh, that's not a good look, is it? I don't think I've heard a more deafening 6 seconds of silence in my life, if I'm being honest. Crowder even used this clip as the intro to the video because it just doesn't look great. Anyway, she does agree that the assassination was political violence, but she rightfully struggles to reconcile how the Hortmans don't fit under that same definition. Fortunately for us though, we have good faith political actor Stephen Crowder ready to explain it to us.
Because the express motive of the terrorist who assassinated Charlie Kirk was politics. He killed him because he said he's one of those hateful conservative right-wingers. The rhetoric that he espoused, the reason that he killed Charlie Kirk, was to take out someone of his political persuasion and make others of his political persuasion afraid to express their opinions. The man who assassinated, which I roundly condemn, Vance Bolter, the Hortmans, did not do it as a means to a political end. Charlie Kirk was assassinated, he is not an elected official, solely because of his political perspective as a method to instill terror in the populace.
Yeah.
Wow, if only Crowder was this quick to point out political violence when it was supposedly coming from the right. Now, before this devolves into a speculative shitshow, let's run through some of the facts that we know about Tyler Robinson, aka Charlie Kirk's alleged assassin. First off are the text messages which he sent to his roommate, which were released by the FBI. Why? Why did I do it? Yeah, I had enough of his hatred. Some hate can't be negotiated out. Additionally, his mother told investigators that Robinson talked about the assassination in similar terms with them, saying that Kirk spread too much hate. Now, this is definitely a nitpick more than anything, but those two quotes are pretty different to what Crowder said in his conversation with Christina, as he directly said that he killed him because he's one of those hateful conservative right-wingers. There was no mention of political affiliation. That was Crowder just kind of embellishing the truth to support his argument, and it's something he does a little later on in this video too. On top of this, his mother also told investigators that Robinson had become more political and had started to lean more to the left, becoming more pro-gay and trans rights oriented. It has also been reported that Robinson was romantically involved with his roommate, who happens to be a trans woman, and that's just had the worst people on the internet using it for all sorts of conspiracy theories. And finally, we have the most contentious bit of information around this case, the bullet engravings. One casing read, "Hey fascists, catch," with a reference to Helldivers 2 afterwards. Another said, "If you read this, you are gay, Lamau." A third read, "Bella Ciao," a reference to an Italian anti-fascist resistance song. And the fourth bullet read, "Notices bulge, oh, what's this?" Not gonna lie, it's kinda jarring to see internet speak on the bullets which killed the most influential right-wing activists in the US, but I digress. These are all the key pieces of evidence we have around the case right now, and as I'm going to continue to reiterate over and over, this is all speculative because the trial hasn't even started yet. So, with that being said, let's speculate. One thing a lot of people in the media have been talking about, both left and right, is the fact that the text messages feel a little bit fishy. Some people have pointed out that the language used feels very tactical to suggest that it was fabricated by an FBI agent, and there's also the fact that at times the messages kind of read like "How do you do, fellow kids?" And look, I gotta be honest here, it was kind of disappointing to see so many people on the left turn to conspiracy theories so damn quickly. Of course, in such a high-profile case like this, some degree of skepticism is warranted, but to think that the FBI would use obviously faked messages in a criminal trial where their veracity would be immediately disproved feels, I don't know, a little bit short-sighted. But with that being said, there are two things I find strange about the text messages. One, the FBI releasing these in the middle of an investigation feels, I don't know, questionable at best. And two, it's weird that they cherry-pick certain excerpts out without including any timestamps whatsoever. This is something Candace Owens of all people pointed out, and I actually agree that it presents a fragmented timeline which has only fueled the level of conspiratorial thinking. Again, the trial is yet to begin, and who knows, maybe they'll find a handwritten letter from Robinson where he claims that, I don't know, Ron DeSantis told him to assassinate Kirk so he could get a position in the White House. At that point, Crowder would simply have to concede that this man was not of sound mind, he can't stand for a criminal trial, and this therefore could not be an act of political violence. But with the evidence that is currently available, and in the balance of probabilities, it seems more likely than not that this was a case of left-wing political violence. Ooh, look at that, it's a concession. Now, I do want to make something clear, because there's an element of realpolitik to all this. When you're not an opportunistic scumbag like Steven Crowder absolutely is, and you actually value the truth, you put yourself at a big disadvantage in conversations like these. Whilst Crowder will never mention any of the evidence which contradicts or undermines the narrative he's trying to sell you about the assassination of Melissa Hortman, a liberal acting in good faith will when it comes to Charlie Kirk. It reminds me of that classic saying which Democrats love to invoke. When they go low, we go high. But guess what? That's not an effective strategy when it comes to the game of politics and winning hearts and minds. Conservatives like Crowder are simply doing better propaganda when they willfully ignore the evidence which undermines the narrative they're trying to construct. Like sure, being truthful is the moral thing to do, but when you're going up against a movement which is headed by Donald fucking Trump, a guy who made over 30,000 false or misleading claims in his first term as president, well, at some point, you kinda gotta go band for band. It's crazy because I'm not even an American, and I flinch when I suggest that Kirk's assassination was possibly an instance of left-wing political violence, because it would never be reciprocated by the right, as Steven Crowder has already shown us in this video. And look, you might think I'm being a little harsh on Steven right now, but trust me, when we get to the way he lies about some of the cases of left-wing political violence later in this video, you'll see exactly what I mean. Anyway, we've made it this far into the video, and you may have noticed that Crowder hasn't actually argued his main point particularly well. If you remember, his thesis going into this discussion with Christina was, and I quote, "By and large, the political violence is coming from the left. It's not proportionate, with that on the right. However, this conversation has only covered individual cases thus far, and we're yet to see any statistics or data which prove what's happening on a more macro level. Fortunately for us though, Crowder is about to drop some absolute truth bombs which show us just how violent the left actually is.
If you look at the polls post-assassination of Charlie Kirk, and you label yourself as a moderate, those who identify as liberal support political violence at a ratio of 6-1 to conservatives. The YouGov poll said, is political violence acceptable? 77% of conservatives said not at all. Only 38% of those on the left said not at all. 62% of those on the left said somewhat to completely acceptable. We see the same stats after the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. We see the same stats after the fire bombings of the Tesla dealership. And we see the same stats on the opposite side, those on the right roundly condemning political violence. The lowest you'll find is 72. You usually find it in the high 80s. You will not find a number that breaks half on the left.
That's right, you heard it here first. To quote Crowder verbatim, those who identify as liberal support political violence at a ratio of 6-1 to conservatives. I have literally no idea where Crowder sourced this claim on because I couldn't find it on his fact sheet and I couldn't even find it in my own research. Alarm bells should immediately be going off when somebody like Steven Crowder makes such an outrageous claim like that because I can't find it anywhere. But okay, let's tackle the other stuff. Crowder claims that a YouGov poll asked respondents, is political violence acceptable? And this is yet another misrepresentation of the truth. If you go to the fact sheet that he provided, you'll see the actual question which YouGov asked. Do you generally consider it to be acceptable or unacceptable for a person to be happy about the death of a public figure they oppose? Well, that was a bit different to what Crowder was claiming, isn't it? I think you'd agree that there's a pretty big difference between outright supporting political violence versus finding it acceptable to be happy when somebody dies. For example, if we were back in 1945 and just found out that Hitler had taken his own life, 77% of Republicans, who I hope would consider Hitler a public figure they oppose, would find it unacceptable to be happy about that. Also, I seem to recall a lot of conservatives celebrating and being extremely happy over the death of Osama bin Laden in 2011.
We have caught and compromised to a permanent end Osama bin Laden.
Now sure, you may argue that those are two extreme examples, but I think it highlights the fact that responding usually unacceptable is a perfectly reasonable response to have to a question like this. But okay, if we narrow our scope, we can see that 11% of Democrats find it usually or always acceptable to be happy when a public figure they oppose dies, whereas only 6% of Republicans do. Now, even if this isn't a direct stamp of approval for political violence like Crowder frames it to be, it is still at least a little worrying, but I want to give some context to these numbers. Firstly, and most importantly, look at the day this question was asked. September 12th. Yeah, not even 48 hours after Charlie Kirk had been assassinated, and we're asking people for their raw, unfiltered thoughts on the death of public figures. Now, I'm not sure if you guys remember, but emotions were running a little bit high at that point in time, and political tensions reached a level which hasn't been seen since the Capitol attack in 2021. Obviously, that outrage is going to influence how Republicans view political violence, and that's why we saw the responses that we did. Like, consider this hypothetical for a second. Although the left doesn't have a public figure who's comparable to Charlie Kirk and his level of influence, imagine if YouGov asked that question after, God forbid, somebody like Jon Stewart was assassinated. Even though he's primarily a comedian, he's held in very high regard by liberals for his political commentary, and that's why people are pushing for him to run for president in 2028. So if someone like him were assassinated and you asked Democrats that exact same question not even 48 hours after his death, I think you'd agree that the results would look quite a bit different. There's just always going to be that knee-jerk reaction when someone on your side is the target of political violence. And look, this isn't just speculation on my behalf, it's an observable trend. If we look at polling from YouGov, where they ask the question, how big of a problem do you think political violence is in the US today? Just look at how it fluctuates. After Paul Pelosi was attacked in October 2022, 53% of Democrats said political violence was a very big problem, whereas only 31% of Republicans did. Then, after the assassination attempt of Donald Trump in July 2024, that increased to 57% of Republicans and decreased to 47% of Democrats. It then flipped again in 2025 after the assassination attempt on Josh Shapiro and the death of Melissa Hortman, and of course, it just skyrocketed to 67% of Republicans after Kirk's assassination. So yes, unsurprisingly, when the single most influential activist from your side of the political aisle is murdered in cold blood, that is going to cause a large portion of your base to respond quite dramatically to questions of this nature. Of course, Crowder is never going to give you that context on these polls and how they fluctuate, because, say it with me, that would undermine the narrative he's trying to sell you. I hope this trend is starting to become a little more clear. And actually, on the topic of undermining his narrative, it's interesting that Crowder didn't mention what some of the other polls have to say about support for political violence. Prior to the assassination of Charlie Kirk, it was very clear which side was showing a higher propensity for political violence. In a poll from March 2024, respondents were given this statement: Americans may have to resort to violence in order to get the country back on track. Of those who agreed, only 12% were Democrats compared to 28% of Republicans. Then, even after the assassination of Charlie Kirk, and that same polling institution asked the exact same question, Republicans still came out on top by 3%. Of course, it is worrying to see support for political violence climb so dramatically amongst Democrats, but don't you find it a little interesting that Crowder seems to be allergic to data which doesn't support his arguments? Ever since Donald Trump tried to convince his base that the 2020 election was stolen and January 6 happened, support for political violence has rested predominantly with one side of the aisle. But fuck, you know what? I'm gonna be cringe and both sides this for a second, because it actually turns out that all the polling on support for political violence is extremely misleading. As data journalist G. Elliott Morris points out, the vagueness in how these questions are phrased inflates the level of support for political violence. When a pollster says Americans may have to resort to violence to get the country back on track, well yeah, maybe they will if there's a civil war or the government is actively terrorizing the population. But, to quote Morris directly, these polls don't ask if they believe there's no other alternative at this point than to resort to political violence. As soon as you're more specific, the actual support for violence in America's current political climate is much lower. Just take a look at some of the preliminary findings from a survey conducted by Ryan Kennedy, a professor of political science at Ohio State University. Take, for example, this question: do you think it is ever justified for citizens to resort to violence in order to achieve political goals? The lack of a specific scenario or location in this question invites respondents to engage in all kinds of philosophical and historical speculation. In my survey, almost 15% of respondents said violence could sometimes be justified. When asked about the examples they were thinking of, respondents cited the American Revolution, the anti-Nazi French Resistance, and many other incidents as a reason for their responses. Only about 3% of respondents said they were thinking about actions in the US at the current time. Moreover, almost all respondents stated that violence should be a last resort when all other peaceful and legal methods fail. And look, this nuance is crucial because people are much more likely to support political violence when they think the other side supports political violence. When respondents were told that 30% of Americans support felony violence, when it's only 5% in reality, that increased the share of all US adults who say they support partisan violence in the real world by almost 10 percentage points. This is a doom loop where misunderstanding the other side is directly leading to more support of political violence. To quote Morris again, people are saying, hey, well, if they want to hurt me, I might as well hurt them back. Fair enough. The problem is that, at a minimum, 95% of Americans do not want to hurt you based on your politics. Other research finds that support for partisan murder, in particular, is opposed by 99% of adults. I mean, God, just look at how both sides misunderstand each other with some polling from October 2020. Whilst actual support for political violence sat at about 10% for both Republicans and Democrats, when people were asked to estimate how much the other side of politics supported violence, both groups said 40%. You guys are all off by a factor of 4. In reality, when you ask better and more specific questions, it's somewhere between 1 in 20 and 1 in 30 of Americans that support political violence, and it doesn't really differ that much between parties. That means the single most crucial thing in times like these is for political leaders to come out and turn the temperature down so you don't have this doom loop where both sides are supporting violence more and more. And thankfully, that's exactly what Donald J. Trump did after Kirk's assassination.
For years, those on the radical left have compared wonderful Americans like Charlie to Nazis and the world's worst mass murderers and criminals. This kind of rhetoric is directly responsible for the terrorism that we're seeing in our country today, and it must stop right now.
Oh, yeah, that's the President of the United States actively fanning the flames, increasing political tensions, and making further violence more likely. Wonderful. When you compare that to Biden's speech after the attempted assassination on Trump, it's just a night and day difference.
My fellow Americans, want to speak to you tonight about the need for us to lower the temperature in our politics. And to remember, while we may disagree, we are not enemies. We're neighbors, we're friends, co-workers, citizens, and most importantly, we're our fellow Americans. We must stand together.
So, just to summarize, all the polling on political violence is extremely misleading. The inaccurate results it has produced only fuel the likelihood of more violence occurring in this perceived tit-for-tat between the left and right. When you believe that your opponents are more likely to support political violence, that in turn makes your side more likely to support political violence, leading to this really ugly positive feedback loop. That's why Crowder presenting this YouGov poll without any context is so dangerous, as his audience is going to go and run with the narrative that liberals are more likely to support political violence at a ratio of 6-1 to conservatives, when that is just categorically false. Anyway, I think it's time we get back to the central claim of Crowder's video. I'm getting up. Oh, my knee. Oh, my knee. Ow. Remember, Crowder's argument was, and I quote, by and large, the political violence is coming from the left. It's not proportionate with that on the right. And so far, we've only looked at a handful of anecdotes and some opinion polling. Neither of these things necessarily prove who is committing more political violence, and it takes Crowder 27 minutes into his conversation with Christina to finally mention some of the stats. And brace yourself, this is where things get especially egregious.
And the problem is, amidst that, the left is saying, actually, there's more political violence coming from the right. And that's the rhetoric we've been hearing, and it's dishonest. In other words, data is being presented to the public deliberately, dishonestly, to victim blame. So the two sources in the data are the Prosecution Project, that's what's cited in The Economist and NPR, and Cato. These are the ones where they say, hey, right-wing violence is more prevalent. I'm sure you've heard that.
So, to kick things off, let's first take a look at the Prosecution Project, or the TPP. As you can see from this graph, which was used in an article by The Economist, one side has been doing a little more politically motivated violence than the other for the past 35 years. Now, just to be abundantly clear, this graph is showing the amount of criminal cases involving political violence by ideology resulting in a guilty verdict, meaning it does not account for the severity of the crime itself. For example, there has only ever been one guilty verdict handed down by a US court over the 9/11 attacks. Even though 3,000 people were killed, it's just a blip on the line graph for jihadists in 2001. Now, this may seem obvious, but the reason there's only one guilty verdict is because all 19 hijackers died during the attack, and dead people can't go to court. You might think it's weird of me to make a big point of that, but trust me, it'll be relevant very soon. Anyway, yeah, the trend is blatantly clear. Of the 3,639 total cases resulting in a guilty verdict between 1990 and 2025, 7.6% were committed by the left, 55.4% were committed by the right, 19.9% were committed by jihadists, and 17.2% were of other affiliations or unclear. And of the 417 cases which resulted in at least one fatality, 3.5% were committed by the left, 70.7% were committed by the right, 11% were committed by jihadists, and 14.9% were of other affiliations or unclear. Then, the next source which Crowder mentions is the Cato Institute. With their slightly different methodology, and excluding 9/11, which distorts the numbers, they found that around 10% of politically motivated murders have come from the left since 1975, and 63% have come from the right. Then, another source which Crowder mentions in his conversation is the CSIS.
Or a Cato study, which is reflected by the CSIS as well.
If we take a look at their numbers, well, this graph of terrorist attacks and plots since 1994 paints a pretty clear picture. Or, I guess a pretty red picture. If we narrow the scope to just the past decade, you can see that only 13 people have been killed in 35 attacks from left-wing political violence versus 112 people who have been killed in 152 attacks from the right. Then, there's all the evidence which Crowder doesn't mention in his video. In an article written by Art Gibson and Paul Becker, two professors of sociology, they estimate that right-wing extremist violence accounts for somewhere between 75 and 80% of US domestic terrorism deaths since 2001. This 2021 study on far left versus far right fatal violence found that, even with the exclusion of deaths from the Oklahoma City bombing, deaths from far-right ideologically motivated homicides average 11.5 per year from 1990 to 2020, compared to only 2.5 deaths from the far left for the same period. Independent analysis from the ADL, which, as you can imagine, has not been taken seriously by the worst people on the internet, have found 76% of all extremist-related murders between 2015 and 2024 were committed by the right. I mean, fuck, there was even a study which the DOJ had to remove from their website after the assassination of Kirk which opened with this. Since 1990, far-right extremists have committed far more ideologically motivated homicides than far-left or radical Islamist extremists, including 227 events that took more than 520 lives. In this same period, far-left extremists committed 42 ideologically motivated attacks that took 78 lives. No matter where you decide to look, the evidence is irrefutable. The right is significantly more violent and has been for the past 35 years in America. Even though different studies may use slightly different definitions and methodologies in their analysis, the consensus is clear. So, with that in mind, let's see how Crowder tries to bend his narrative around this empirical reality.
Let me show you what they don't include in the data, because like you said, people speak differently than data. Remember this in Portland?
When was this?
Summer of Love, George Floyd riots. Aaron Danielson, shot point blank dead because he was a Trump voter. And the man, Reinhold, it was Michael Reinhold who shot him, told the cops, I got the Trump supporter, dead. We agree that's political violence?
Yes, of course.
Not a single one of these places cites it. It doesn't exist in their database.
Well, damn, according to Crowder, none of these databases have recorded this blatant case of left-wing political violence. And I mean, hell, if they don't have something as obvious as this, what else could they be missing, and why should we trust any of the data they release? Well, okay, to kick things off, let's first understand the case which Crowder is talking about. On August 29th, 2020, during the George Floyd protests in Portland, Michael Reinhold, a self-proclaimed anti-fascist, shot and killed Aaron Danielson, a member of the far-right group Patriot Prayer. Now, I don't want to get too bogged down in the details of this case, because they're not super relevant to the point Crowder's making, but we'll touch on a couple things. Firstly, a minor nitpick. Crowder is extremely wrong about the subtitles in this video. The voice does not say, "We've got a Trumper here," it says, "We've got a couple here," which is much more obvious if you look at the video from a different angle. Obviously, this isn't super important, but it's yet again another time where Crowder has embellished the truth. He did a similar thing when he exaggerated what Tyler Robinson said about Charlie Kirk, and I think it's an interesting pattern to note. Anyway though, you're not gonna find me defending what happens next. Security camera footage shows Reinhold duck into a garage, which allows him to get behind Danielson as he walks past, which does suggest that this was a planned ambush. He then emerges, seemingly reaching for a gun in his pocket. There's a bit of yelling. Danielson begins to lunge at Reinhold, spraying bear mace as he does so, and Reinhold shoots him dead. There's a little more to it. I've linked a video down below if you're interested, but overall, yeah, a far-left extremist killed this dude. This was the first time in 26 years that a self-identified anti-fascist was charged with homicide. So, if we head on over to the prosecution project and look up Michael Reinhold in their database, oh my god, Crowder is right. He isn't anywhere to be seen. Just look at how he explains it to Christina.
Yeah.
Did it, clear as day. Are you a Trump supporter? Yes, we've got a Trump supporter. Bang, bang, dead. All the studies from left-wing sources don't include that. Is that bothersome?
You're right, Crowder. This is really bothersome. It almost seems like this is a politically biased cover-up by Marxist academics trying to hide the true amount of left-wing political violence. I mean, come on. There could be no other possible explanation, right? Right? Well, do you remember what I said about 9/11 earlier? How only one person has ever been found guilty for their involvement because all the hijackers died in the attack? Well, if you did any research, Stephen, you'd know that Michael Reinhold was shot dead by police 5 days after this incident. Crowder tries to frame this like it's some sort of conspiracy, but no. The reason Reinhold doesn't appear in the database is because he never went to court on account of him being, dead. Remember, Stephen, you can't stand trial if you're not alive. And look, we're not gonna open the other can of worms, which is Reinhold's death. The events of that day are heavily disputed, but a court did find that the police were justified in using lethal force, but it's a very complicated story. But anyway, a modicum of research would have made this abundantly clear to Crowder. All he had to do was visit the frequently asked questions page on the prosecution project's website, scroll down a little, and boom. Just take a look at what it says. Do you track all instances of political violence? No. The purpose of the prosecution project has never been to track all acts of political violence. Each criminal defendant is a separate row of data, and crimes with no defendant are excluded. This means a crime may not be included for a number of reasons, such as the crime meets the inclusion criteria, there is a known perpetrator, but the individual was never charged with a crime, e.g., the individual is killed on sight. Or, in the case of Michael Reinhold, the individual was killed 5 days later, and therefore couldn't be prosecuted. Like, Stephen, it's quite literally in the name of the fucking project itself. And guess what? This also means that the guy who went and shot up the Mormon church wouldn't be included in this database either, because, say it with me, Stephen, dead people can't go to court. But hold on, what about the other sources which Crowder mentioned, like the CSIS and Cato Institute? They're measuring more general political violence and aren't reliant on a prosecution. So what did they say about it? Well, if we go to the Cato database and look up Reinl, it's right there, listed as left-wing violence. And if we go to the CSIS, they wrote a full fucking article where they directly talk about the killing of Aaron Danielson as a left-wing terror attack. So, just to summarize here, the prosecution project doesn't have it because dead people can't go to court, and the other two sources that he referenced both have it listed as left-wing political violence. This was all available to Crowder before he recorded this installment of Change My Mind on September 30th, so that isn't an excuse either. His whole slam dunk, which was supposed to undermine the veracity of these databases, it just falls apart instantly. I genuinely cannot believe this is the quality of research that Crowder brought to a video like this. Anyway, turns out that Crowder isn't finished because he decides to bring up another example.
You know what else is included? Daryl Brooks in Waukesha, Wisconsin, who ran people over in the parade out of an exclusive defund the police, Black Lives Matter, anti-white, black supremacist ideology. That's why he killed them. That's not included.
Did you hear that? Apparently this guy ran people over out of an exclusive defund the police, Black Lives Matter, anti-white, black supremacist ideology. Please keep that in mind as we unpack this case. So, the incident Crowder is talking about here occurred on the 21st of November 2021 in Waukesha, Wisconsin. A man by the name of Daryl Brooks got in his car at around 4 p.m. and drove through a Christmas parade, killing 6 people and injuring another 62. This was a complete tragedy of an event to hit such a small city, so what led Brooks to do this? Well, Crowder once again left out some important details. 5 months before the attack, Brooks was arrested by police for beating his girlfriend and flashing his firearm at her during an argument. Then, 3 weeks before the attack, he was in another fight with his girlfriend where he punched her and then proceeded to run her over with his car. He was charged for this incident and, in what seems utterly insane now, his bail was only set at $1,000. He was able to pay this and was released from custody on November 11th. Then, just prior to the attack, Brooks was involved in another domestic disturbance with his girlfriend, which the authorities were called to. However, he was able to flee the scene before they arrived, and he then proceeded to drive to the parade and commence his attack. Now, it's also important to note that his trial went absolutely viral on the internet because of how unhinged he was. There are videos with millions and millions of views of him flipping out at the prosecutor. He fired his defense attorney so he could represent himself in court, declaring that he was now a sovereign citizen who doesn't believe they're under the jurisdiction of the US government. He was kicked out of the courtroom numerous times for yelling and interrupting, removing his shirt out of anger. The judge even had to halt proceedings at one point because Brooks wouldn't stop death staring at her. This was clearly someone who couldn't control their emotions. So, that begs the question. Where is Crowder getting this black supremacist anti-white ideology from? Well, if we check his fact sheet, the extent of his research is yet again a single New York Post article. If we take a look inside, Facebook detectives found some pretty questionable posts from his account. The first was a pro-Hitler meme from 2015, which, to quote the article, appeared to align with the beliefs of the black Hebrew Israelites. Next was a text post he made in mid-2020, which said he was gonna start knocking white people the fuck out. And finally was another post from mid-2020, where he creatively showed his dissatisfaction with the police. The article also notes Brooks was a rapper who bragged about being a terrorist and a killer in the city prior to the attack. I'm sorry, young thug, but when you rapped, "You call me Osama, I'm passing hundreds to the bombs, yeah, boom boom," that was actually an admission of guilt. So yeah, these are quite literally the only pieces of evidence which tie Brooks to any possible political motive. 3 Facebook posts and some rap lyrics. The police chief of Waukesha made it clear that Brooks acted alone and there was no evidence to suggest it was a terrorist incident. The prosecutor never mentioned a political motive during court proceedings because of how far-fetched the connection was, and the only reason Crowder is bringing this up is because far-right groups tried to warp the narrative to push their white nationalist agenda. So, with all that in mind, what seems more plausible? A mentally unstable person with a history of violent abuse went on a senseless tirade spurred by a domestic disturbance, or because he used the middle finger emoji and then a cop emoji on Facebook, this has to be an anti-white hate crime. Seriously? Do you remember when Crowder claimed that this was an exclusive defund the police, Black Lives Matter, anti-white black supremacist ideology? Yeah, well, it appears as though Crowder was missing some pretty crucial details about Daryl Brooks. So, if I haven't made it clear, the reason that Daryl Brooks isn't listed on any of these databases is because, quite simply, this wasn't a politically motivated attack. But okay, that brings us to the final couple of claims which Crowder has made about the stats on political violence. During his conversation with Christina, he mentions this.
By the way, all of them agree that in the last year, since Donald Trump has been elected, even now they agree 2 to 3 times more leftist violence than right-wing violence.
So, Is this claim true? Well, yeah, it actually is. Looking at the CSIS data, there have been 5 left-wing terrorist attacks or plots this year so far, compared to just 1 on the right. In fact, as the article itself says, 2025 is the first year in the CSIS data where the number of left-wing incidents is greater than the number of right-wing ones. Now, this obviously isn't an insignificant increase, but once again, I think some context will help us here. This is a sample size of 6 over a half-year period, and just take a look at what the articles are actually saying, which Crowder is referencing. The rise in left-wing attacks merits increased attention, but the fall in right-wing attacks is probably temporary, and it too requires a government response. Unsurprisingly, when you look at the historical trend, this level of political violence is a complete outlier for both sides. Since 2020, there has been an average of 24 right-wing terrorist attacks and plots per year versus an average of just 6 coming from the left. This kind of feels like when your conservative uncle points out an abnormally cold day in spring and tries to use that as evidence to disprove global warming. Like, sure, there does seem to be a non-insignificant uptick in the amount of attacks and plots from the left, but given how small the time period is and the tiny sample size, it would be ill-advised to extrapolate too quickly from this dataset. There was also this pretty good passage I found from that same CSIS article. Most notably, the administration has aggressively targeted immigrants with high-profile efforts to identify, detain, and deport them. Anti-immigrant sentiment is one of the most important violent extremist motivations in recent years. The Trump administration has also warned of the deep state abuses, criticized and abolished programs involving diversity, promoted some conspiracy theories, and hired individuals who openly embraced white supremacy. In addition, Trump's victory temporarily ended many concerns about a Democrat-orchestrated stolen election, a leading conspiracy that motivated many extremists in the past. Enrique Tarrio, the former Proud Boys leader and a convicted seditionist whom Trump pardoned, recently summed up the president's potential psychological effect on the violent far right. Honestly, what do we have to complain about these days? So yeah, maybe in the long term, we will see a more permanent decline in the amount of right-wing political violence thanks to Trump and his quasi-authoritarianism. I'm not sure if that's an ideal way of solving it, but hey, when there are masked ICE agents snatching people off the streets who have lived in the United States for over 30 years, there really isn't all that much ethno-nationalists have to complain about. Anyway, there's one final claim about the stats that I want to take a look at.
You know what else isn't? All the riots, the billions in damages, the 37 dead during the George Floyd riots, the thousands of officers assaulted, the thousands of casualties, that's not included.
Now, I hope this isn't too much of a shock, but Stephen is wrong once again. The Prosecution Project literally has a page on their website dedicated to the George Floyd protests where it has more than 1,743 cases listed. As for the Cato database, well, they only list political murders. Although it's estimated that about 25 people were killed in 2020 during the protests, only a small fraction of those deaths were actually deemed to be politically motivated murders. A lot of the deaths were by law enforcement and deemed legal. There was a handful of rather controversial self-defense cases, a good chunk were opportunistic looters, and some people were never identified or their perpetrator wasn't, which makes the motives unclear. Just take a scroll through the wiki page of the people killed and you'll probably see what I mean. Anyway, I don't think that these studies are bulletproof, and I'm sure there are valid criticisms of their methodology and the scope of their definitions, but that isn't what Crowder is doing here. He cherry-picked a handful of cases which he was blatantly wrong about and thought that would be enough to discredit these databases in their entirety. I mean, hell, if you do think there are errors in how they've categorized certain cases, or maybe think they're missing something entirely, you can literally submit feedback to the Prosecution Project's website. I know Stephen has never visited their FAQ page, but if he did, he'd see that all of their research methods are public and they're very transparent with every part of the process because it's supposed to be an empirical, non-partisan database. So again, just to remind you, Crowder's central claim in this video was that the left commits more political violence than the right. Because this is categorically false, as every empirical analysis has shown, he tried to undermine these studies by cherry-picking individual cases, which they didn't include. However, Crowder was comically wrong about the cases that he did mention. He therefore failed to falsify these studies, which means his central thesis remains unproven. I know I can't change his mind, but hopefully I might have changed yours with this video. And there we have it. That was Steven Crowder and his endless lies about political violence. Now look, you may disagree with some of the conclusions I came to in this video, but I hope you can at least understand how fucking deceptive Steven Crowder is in these types of conversations. The way he only presents evidence which supports his side of the political aisle whilst ignoring everything which could possibly undermine the narrative he's trying to construct is just downright deceit. I know this isn't an especially profound observation, but despite the name of the show, Crowder's mind is never being changed here, and this just isn't good faith political discourse. I mean, hell, if there's one quote which really highlights that idea, it'd have to be this one.
I don't believe it's nuanced. I believe there's black and white, pretty clear-cut good and evil in this one. I believe there's pretty black and white, clear-cut who's responsible for the political violence. but I will discuss it with anybody. So did Charlie Kirk, and they kill us anyway.
I don't believe it's nuanced. It's pretty clear-cut good and evil in this one. I mean, look, when you're only using a single source from the New York Post to defend half of your political beliefs, this isn't an especially surprising mindset to have. Unfortunately though, for the rest of us who kinda care about the truth, reality is never this black and white, especially when it comes to extremely contentious political issues. But, as I said earlier, caring about the truth isn't a very effective political strategy, and what Crowder does actually secures elections, so who's the real winner? To end things, I was initially gonna go on a big rant about Trump being the root cause of all the inflammatory rhetoric we see in US politics today, but I actually think Elizabeth Warren put it best.
People who are saying the Democrats need to lower the temperatures.
Oh,
talking about
please.
things and,
Right. Why don't you start with the President of the United States? Right? And every ugly meme he has posted and every ugly word. He is the leader of this nation. And I think that when he's posting things like he did just a couple of days ago, trying to show an entire city on fire, and a reference to helicopters in effect, throwing people out of helicopters and showing himself as some kind of big chest-beating threat, then I just don't want to hear this from the Republicans.
Anyway though, I'm just a dumb Australian who has very little skin in the game. I happen to live in a democracy which actually functions, so good luck to all my Yanks out there. I think you'll be needing it. Just remember that most of these polls on political violence are extremely misleading, your fellow countrymen and women are a lot less radical than you think, and for the love of God, do not trust a single word which ever comes out of Steven Crowder's mouth. If you enjoyed this video, please check out my Discord. I want to start growing that a bit more. You can also check out my Twitter and Instagram. I have a Patreon, which I'll probably start doing something for soon, so you can support me in that way if you want to. And thank you for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.